traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chunonton nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spring Covenant London. This land continues to be home to diverse indigenous peoples, First Nation, Metis, and Inuit, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to the
Thank you so much, Sina. Today's talk is entitled The Author and Finisher of Her Craft, Authentic Creative Control in Selected South African Television Series by Black Women Auteurs. To give a brief abstract, the purpose is to document the experiences of Black women authors in South Africa creative work in mainstream television. Starting with Ayanda Halimana, South African writer and creative director of Makoti, 2019 to 2022. The aim of this research is to not only document the rights of the Black millennial authors, but also shed light on Black women authors who write, produce, and star in the work of South Africa. I'll leave the rest for our speaker to walk us through this interesting talk. And talking about our presenter, let me give you a short bio. Sibusisiwe Gugu Manqele is a multidisciplinary artist, scholar, and social entrepreneur. She's an actress, voice artist, writer, director with a career spanning over 10 years, creating contemporary creative content for multiple notable productions in Africa. Born in northern KwaZulu-Natal, that is Ulindi in South Africa, Sibusisiwe enjoys writing and doing voiceovers in isiZulu. She has written, starred, and executive produced Questions, a short film. As a playwright, she has penned 2 plays, Yini or What Is It? And Migration of the Heart. Her directorial debut was on Passover as an assistant director. The play successfully ran at the Market Theatre for Black History Month in 2021. As the CEO of Contentwood, that is a content production company, Sibusisiwe Gugu Manqele is passionate about telling authentic, emotional, compelling, and universally appealing African stories. Shall we, with a round of applause, welcome our speaker for today's mediation topic.
Thank you so much, President. Afternoon, I nearly said evening. In South African time, it's evening right now. Afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Ebenezer, for such a warm welcome. And thank you so much for everybody for making the time to be here. And to those that are online, truly appreciate you being here. Firstly, I'd just like to start by saying thank you for hosting me at Western University. It's been nothing but pure bliss in the past 2-3 days that I've been here. I do get why they say Canada is a friendly country. All I've received is friendly, is friendliness. So thank you so much. Without wasting any more time, I'll go straight into it. The work that I'm presenting currently is a work in progress, which is for my PhD dissertation, working title, The Author and Finisher of Her Craft, Authentic Creative Control in Selected South African Television Series by Black Women Auteurs. There's a big history in terms of how I've come into this, and I'll just quickly try and walk through it with everybody. Firstly, try now. Yes, okay. So firstly, I'll just give a brief explanation of who I am and how I've come into everything. Like I said, I'm a multidisciplinary artist born in Ulundi, KwaZulu-Natal, and finding myself in the arts. I studied dramatic arts in honors at Wits, and then I went on and did a creative writing honors and found my voice, I would say, into the space of the arts with my MA in film and television, where I was collaborating and really trying to understand what it is to be a multimodal scholar. And that happened with that dissertation of film and television at Wits University, which has led to what I'm currently doing, a PhD in English studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. So my work, and I would say my research interests, are African Black feminist and womanist ideologies, Black Millennial Auteurs, decolonization, trauma, and healing in Black communities within a film and theatre television context. What I've been able to do really is work as a writer in stage and on TV and on radio, and it has really improved, I'd say, my existence as a person in understanding how humans, I would want to say how humans are, in simpler terms, how humans are. Because really art is about how humans are, how we are living our daily lives. And that has moved me into what my research really is about. And I was happy to say one of my research interests is healing within a television and theatre context, because there's so much that needs to be unpacked in that, and this is part of it. So I've done the work in a lot of television shows in South Africa, and I started in reality TV and worked myself back into the arts, into writing theatre and into writing for television. What happened, as I said, with the Masters of Film and Television was that I started making conscious choices in terms of what I wanted to do in my career as an artist and what I wanted to see on my television set or in theatre if I went in. And obviously, most of that, I was saying to Professor Dean Lisa Henderson yesterday, which I acknowledged that Ebenezer asked to be done earlier. I saw how there's an acknowledgement of the land. And firstly, it is to acknowledge, it's always about acknowledging. I come from South Africa. Everybody knows the history of apartheid in South Africa and the power struggles that we have had through the transition of 1994, which I always think the first thing that we always need to do is to acknowledge it. And when we acknowledge it, it's out in the air and we are. So that's always my stance. And that's the work that I said to myself I will do, but not only in saying that there are things to be acknowledged, but in stating that what can we do as artists to move the conversations forward. And that's what I decided to do with the work I did for my MA. So that was then the full circle moment when I was asked to assistant director for Black History Month at the Market Theatre with Passover by Antoinette Nwandu in America. And as an artist working from 2011 to currently, I've always been about the proficiency of mother tongue. South Africa has more than 10 official languages, and it's very important that all those languages are used by the speakers. So that is one of the main things that I'm all about. And then what my research was centered on, my past research, was that in 2013, I starred as a lead in an educational drama series called Intersections in South Africa. And the character I played was Sibusisiwe, who was a pharmaceutical specialist and educated Black woman in the field of science. And she seemed to have it all, but one of her real biggest problems that everybody cared about was her love life. So when I came to Wits in 2012, I thought to myself, I have some questions to ask that I can finally ask myself as a practitioner in the arts and not just ask the director on set when I know that it's not my time to be asking these questions, but I'm there to work and perform as an artist. So that then created my dissertation, which was called Inyanga Nkulu, the Great Physician, looking at the representations of Black women physicians in 3 medical dramas, which was 2 South African ones, one Soul City, and one which was called Josie H, which was actually co-production with a Canadian company, and Grey's Anatomy, American series. And what I was really looking on was weaving together the works of Bell Hooks and the oppositional gaze in Black looks, race and representation, Laura Mulvey's essay on visual pleasure and narrative, and Edward Said's concept of the Occident in his essay. And really what these theorists were focusing on gaze, race, and post-colonial studies were really useful in my research and in terms of grounding it and then creating my creative component, which was then television drama series, which is still a work in progress. Having done that, I sat in the space of pitching it to certain channels and also getting funding for it. And the question, which also led to then my PhD, was how do I move forward? Because the narrative is not really only about writing as a creative and changing the stories that I want to see, but the world is bigger in the business of television itself. So what is it that I need to really be looking at and unpacking as a practitioner? So that then led me to wanting to explore the business of storytelling rather than focusing on the creative outcome. And because, you know, the creative outcome, especially in South Africa, as I've started my interviews, most of the writers have told me how in South Africa, our industry is a television industry. We kicked off a lot with soap operas, and that's why most production houses in South Africa, to sustain themselves, they need to have a long form series of some sort, whether it's a telenovela or a soapy, rather than shorter drama series to live out. Film is still finding its feet, but we are a television industry. And through those questions, then it really came that our work as creators and as writers really is more of a producer's game, rather than the writer's game and how we find our feet. So really wanting to look at the politics of ownership, the visibility as exploitation, concerned about the storyteller's well-being. And then obviously the focus on mainstream television, I would say my disappointment, agonies, and joys have come through navigating mainstream entertainment industry in South Africa for the past 10 to 12 years. And being at the state that I am at, you then say, as you become liberated, you have to foster the culture then of liberating others, which is then the sense of what this work is really about in terms of existence. So I decided that the PhD then will be a documentary that will be looking at the lives of the writers in South Africa and how they are navigating the industry. So as a practitioner with 10 years experience, I'm privy to some good information, if I say so myself. I decided to research the conditions and the stories that are told by Black women authors in South Africa. If they are just writers for their shows, or if they are creative producers, and the difference that makes when they navigate telling their stories as just a writer or a head writer, or as part of the production company as creative producer or executive producer. And then generally in my research, as I was seeing what is out there within the South African landscape, I saw that there are South African scholars, among who are Ndongela Masilela, Lindiwe Dovi, Ruth Tier Tomaselli and Joyce Mystery, who've written intensely about unpacking and interrogating the visual representations on the final picture outcome that is screened, and the audience's interpretations and the history of film and television. I have to mention Joyce Mystery was once a lecturer of mine when I was an undergrad, who has also written a book, Gaze and Regimes, where she's interviewed some authors about their experiences. And that is what I really wanted to tap into in terms of not just the reception of the work, but what is happening behind the scenes, I would say, but not just behind the scenes, but behind the scenes for the creators. And my inciting idea is a very provocative essay by Miss Abrahams, who was, I would urge everybody to look it up. It's from a book called Reflections on Black Women in the Academy. That's the title, and it's Hear Our Voices. And one of the things that always stood out for me is that she would say, I am a historian, you understand. I study change over time. And a part of that studying over change, that provocative essay of hers in Hear Our Voices, is about Black women in the academy and really understanding being an outsider from inside in the spaces that we navigate as Black women. And then I would say I contextualize it with Yvette Abrahams, which is my middle name, and Graham's counter-hegemony and the 5 phases of decolonization as suggested by Polka Chelisa, which is rediscovery, recovery, mourning, dreaming, commitment, and action, and recognition of Black women as creators in the South African landscape of television, production, and film is not adequately documented as their male counterparts, which is why I feel that this is an important work that needs to be documented in South Africa. So the journey and process of the multi-hyphenated Black women authors is under-theorized, as I've mentioned, in television and cultural studies in South Africa, where in other instances we will see the recognition of their male counterparts, but also it is just starting to happen. Just recently, 3 weeks ago, I was a keynote speaker for the renaming of Gibson Kente Theatre in Soweto Theatre. The Red Theatre was turned into Gibson Kente. And Gibson Kente is known as the forefather of Black theatre in South Africa. And he passed away in 1997. His work burned, unfortunately, and we do not have a lot of archives of the plays and the work that he's done. But this is only happening it's commendable that it's happening in 2023 when he passed away in 1997. But we can see the big gap that we have in terms of archives for Black narratives in South Africa and in the democratic spaces that we are in. So the dissertation follows, an interdisciplinary approach, and studying phenomenology as methodology. It's funny how I came into this again, because I thought I would just be looking at the other artists. But the more I started interviewing people or asking if I could interact with other creators in South Africa, everybody kept on pointing back to me and saying, oh, but that's what you were doing. But that's what you are doing also. And it's kind of pointing it back as an autoethnographic exercise for myself also, as a creator in this country, and shaping really a different narrative in what the documentary is going to be. So basically, phenomenology is one of the many types of qualitative research that examines the lived experiences of humans, and the lived experiences that will be explored will be the Black women authors in South Africa. And the discussion will focus on the selected episodes. I'll be starting with Ayanda Halimana, who is the head writer and creative producer of Makoti, which aired between 2019 to 2022 in South Africa. Her as a creative producer and head writer in that show is not a common thing in South Africa. So I would say it is that walk of walking into empowered presence, for Black authors in South Africa, and the need to decolonize our curriculums by putting this work forward, by documenting it as it comes and not waiting for 20 years afterwards to document the work of people that are on the ground currently, as I recently did, which was an honor for Bragib, which is Bragibson Kente. So the scope will focus on the women authors and ownership within a television context. And as a multi-module scholar situated in English studies, I use television studies, literary studies, and cultural studies as the basis of this interdisciplinary research. And furthermore, I'll draw insights from another number of disciplines: ethnography, media studies, and African Black feminist and womanist theories. My method is including selected scripts from the plays, from the series that I've chosen, and the data collection of newspapers, academic articles, reports and observations, press interviews and interviews with Black women authors, which will assess how the process from script to production functions and its effects on the authors and the creative work outcome as it's finally released on picture for public viewing. I just want to read a quote by Christian and White, who speaks about organic representation begins when systems and institutions empower those who have been historically marginalized, not only to appear in their stories, but also to own and fine-tune narratives, marketing, and distribution. And quickly, I would just want to go into some few quotes with Ayanda. I was hoping that we would have a snippet of a video of our interview, but it really didn't. All I have to say is a picture of us together. But as I read that quote, what stood out for me and what I just remembered is what she said that stood out in one of our first recorded meetings, was that as a writer, I had a voice on what goes on air. And a lot of people never understand that when they are watching shows and it's the head writer's name on the show, that it's almost 50% not always what they had put on that page and what they had wanted to go out to the world because of what happens between production, between the producers, between the broadcasters, or if it is commissioning whoever. So those kind of conversations. And since I'm already here, let me go back then to just introducing her properly. What I then looked also in terms of living in a global community was that in South Africa, we do not have a lot of, I would say, multi-module scholar papers that are out, and it is a budding community and we are growing. I was fortunate enough to be in that conference in Paris, and after meeting Lisa, oh yes. After meeting Lisa, my world also opened up to a whole bunch of other artists who are in conversations with other artists in South Africa, but everybody just seems to be operating in their own little corners. But to have the work out, I would say, is the big thing, because if we have it on paper, then we have records of it. And that's what I'm really about with this this project. So in terms of a global community, Timeka N. Tansel's article on productive vulnerability, where she writes about Black women writers and narratives of humanity in contemporary cable television, is an ethnographic account of how American Black authors such as Mara Brooke Akil, creators of Being Mary Jane, and Issa Rae, creators of Insecure, have deployed counter-hegemonic strategies in mainstream television in depicting Black women and Black narratives. And this strategy can be interpreted in Black womanist and feminist thoughts as a form of learning from the outsider within. Manqele Cole, creator of I May Destroy You and Chewing Gum, released a mentorship gift in 2020 for her fans in the form of a Google Drive document documenting her experiences with producing her first show, which I say is a treasure for anybody who wants to go into the television industry, because she speaks about her first episode never having seen a script herself, but having written it and getting her first deal, and all those very important factors about being creators and creatives and creators of color in the industry of television. By just naming these women in the different countries in America and in the UK, the story is universal of how Black women authors or Black women of color are treated in television, in media, I would say. And the more conversations that we have and the more that we write and engage is then the only way that we then move into our restorative conversations, and not just restorative conversations, but creating the worlds that we are wanting to see. And by naming them, I want to also name as many other South African creators also who are doing the same work, but at this particular juncture have not been named yet. So it is a very important thing to name and document our history as we move. And that's really just the progression of this work. I'm naming Ayanda Halimana a lot for this, because she is on board currently, and there are other creatives in South Africa that I'm in conversations with as the work is also moving forward. But I'm just saying, because I'm speaking of women, but I keep naming one person. So just to say that this is the one that I've already had show. So to introduce Makoti, Ayanda Halimana is a creative director and producer, and they've done 2 seasons of Makoti, which first aired on the South African national broadcaster, SABC, on a primetime slot at 19:30, and is now available on Prime Video for online streaming. So this research will apply a close reading of the text and an autoethnographic account of the author's experience as a Black woman writer. So Makoti is a dramedy inspired by Missteps of a Young Wife, a blog that explores modern day relationships by following 4 couples at different stages of their relationship or marriage. Ayanda Halimana is a screenwriter, script editor, story development consultant, and screenwriting workshop facilitator with 16 years in the television industry. Ayanda has worked at the largest broadcast channels in South Africa, SABC and Mnet, as a commissioning editor, and as a head writer, she's worked on over 7 episodic shows. She head wrote and creative produced the 2nd season of Makoti. Through her company, Ayanda Halimana Films, she has delivered script writing programs for KZN in 2019 and school programs in 2021 and 2023, known as the script writing program. She wrote Happiness Ever After, a sequel to Happiness is a 4-letter word, which is on Netflix. And she is one of the mentors for the Realness African Residency 22, and was one of the mentors of at the Episodic Lab by Realness Institute Netflix. what is important about this is that a lot of people in South Africa, young creatives, do not know about people like Ayanda Halimana. So this work is really important to get her out and to get exposure on the work that she is doing for young creatives in South Africa, because exposure and also seeing representations of yourself inspires you then to get out there and do what you've seen, because there's a big gap in terms of that throughout South Africa. So that's just another point that I'm adding. And on record in our conversations and in interviews, Ayanda says Makoti is a dramedy that looks into relationships and is specifically a story of everyday people, normal stories. She says our concern or the gap that we saw was that everything on SATV was about violence, was about drugs, corruption, and witchcraft. And we wanted to do something fresh in the 7:30 slot. And they managed to do that with the show, which is Makoti really looking at different areas and relationships. And as I mentioned before, she says as a writer, I had a voice on what goes on air. And for her, that was a big thing. In her 16-year career, she had the choices to do. And the point of South Africa is a television industry and not a film industry yet. We took off through soap operas, and television is a producer space, is one of the many conversations I had with Ayanda, which is being documented in the documentary that I'm currently working on. And one of the main ones also, because of television being the main spots, the cutting costs and where really the injuries, I would say, happen in terms of production companies and cutting costs, and how the workspace then becomes toxic in a way, is the other parts that we are going to then unpack with the different creators. But even at this point, one of the other creators that I'm yet to get a confirmation from is another show that I'm currently working on, which is Skim, an educational show which is run for over 12 seasons in South Africa. One of the only few Black-owned shows in South Africa, which is doing exceptionally well. I had the honor last year, I think maybe it's going to Paris. So I came from Paris, I got interviewed by them, and I started working with them. It is, I would say, as I research and I say I'm researching healing and restorative narratives in our industry, that show and that production and how they run it is a restorative narrative for my own individual self as a creator in South Africa, in terms of how their professionalism and how they treat their cast, their crew, and everybody that works on the show. So while also pointing out these ills that happen, I think it is very important then to show how a well-oiled machine is also running. And I hope to get that approval from the head of the company to just also include them. How this will look in paper is that there'll be a section of just documenting the rise of Black authors and really including this for decolonizing the curriculum, access to the scripts and access to the pitch documents, and just unpacking that as the writer, and also what I get from insights with the artists I'm working with. And just the picture, which I was hoping to be a video, but didn't work out, of my first interview really with Ayanda Halimana, which is in work in progress for this participatory documentary, I would say, that is in the works. And just to wrap up, what the work is there'll be a participatory documentary, which is the story behind her story currently as a working title, and just owning the narrative and shaping it and using it to our best abilities, bringing pieces of you in your work, which is a big call for myself as an artist also, because hiding behind it, I've realized that I'm also part of it. And just personal cultural experiences and perspectives. And basically, the study is seeking to analyze within a South African context the empowered presence of Black women authors who have historically been economically marginalized and affected by the commercialization and capitalistic hegemony in the business of storytelling, revealing the factors that determine production value and distribution by unpacking the reasons and the processes that connect the art of storytelling to its production and distribution, which is what we will be looking at. And just a lovely quote within that of how culture is made possible through lived experiences. And that's where I return to art, because art is really about us showing that we are, and by being, that's the work that we are creating. And I would say ngiyabonga in isiZulu, which is thank you.
Thank you very much, Sibusisiwe. Now is our time for questions. Please stay up here. It's not an explicit space, so please stay up here. You need to displace you. Does anyone either in person or online have any questions? If I may start, we'll get the ball rolling here. I was really intrigued with that one quote you shared from Ayanda Halimana. South Africa is a television industry, not a film industry yet. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we do have films, quite a lot of films that are being watched and consumed in South Africa. But in that context, also as a practitioner, there's more work and stability for writers, I would say, here looking at writers through television. And that's why she was saying that it is a television game more than a film industry, because films are not being consumed in the same way as television in South Africa. So that's where I would say incomes are coming from the creators, and that's how, yeah.
Okay, and will the film industry also start to change or maybe develop as well?
It is developing, and there are quite a few films. So you have writers who write for television, but are also writing films on the side. But it's not consistent in that way that it's a big film industry. She wrote a sequel actually for a film that was one of the best. It broke records in 2016 of Love is 4-letter word in 2016, and that was one of the best films in South Africa. But it's there's a big gap rather than television.
Okay, that's very interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah. Thank you. Does anyone? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, on the same point, maybe you can talk about my familiarity with the film and television industry, South Africa. It is still heavily impacted by kind of apartheid, like
yes,
ownership of the infrastructure for production and distribution, like you said. So there is a film industry, but it's really fractured. And the one that exists, you know, and it's quite, and I would say also television commercial productions in Cape Town, for instance, is quite a lucrative industry, but it's very locked racially in terms of who can get in there and who can't. And then the same thing, I think, outside of that, with the television industry and with the film industry, it's seeking from the same pot of money. So maybe you can this is all public funding. Like, so you were saying that SABC is the producer of a lot of the shows that you're going to be interfacing with in the season. You know, that I know that the SABC has had its issues as it's been bankrupt a few times, which then leaves the writers without kind of an infrastructure to like pick back up the pieces, you know, so it's still this like really fragile, these fragile industries that really have this living legacy of apartheid still playing out. I don't know if you want to say more about that, kind of as you were saying that, I had the same question
Yes.
in like, kind of, in answering like why South Africa is a more predominantly a television industry. TV is more accessible, cinemas aren't, they're locked in these like fortress malls.
Yeah.
That aren't accessible to many
Small
people.
towns.
Yes, and then Hollywood is dominating those screens rather than local productions. Like, are you in the interviews, in the research that you're doing, are you going to be kind of exploring a bit of why Black women creators are feeling locked into the TV space? So that's also, I guess, how
that's a good question. That's a good question, even for me to stitch with at this moment. Thank you for that. I'm actually processing that. I'm actually processing that one. Yeah, no, I am.
Oh, sorry. Does anyone else have any questions?
Okay.
Thank you.
I was like, okay. Well, I was just curious to hear more about like the documentary methodology and kind of what the process for developing that as a methodological framework in your research, just because I haven't, of course, I was wondering if you just speak to kind of maybe like, yeah, like what role do your participants play? How do you kind of decide to, how do you anticipate making decisions about how to structure that narrative?
So initially, I just wanted it to be the interviews of the creators of the shows who would consent to being a part of the documentary. But as I've been working on the proposal for it, I am considering following them through in the productions that they are currently going to be doing, if they'd be so happy to allow at least a week or 2 weeks of whatever production, whether it's from post-production to current production, and then have our sit-in interviews. What came through that lunch date with Ayanda that was recorded, it was supposed to be an hour, it ended up being almost 4 hours because we had so many similar stories. We had to stop when we wanted to not mention names of certain things and certain things that have happened, but we just need to I then also need to get to a point of deciding what is it that we don't get out. And obviously legally, there are some things we can't say because there are some people who sign certain NDAs also about their working conditions before. But it's also, somebody said it's not a crime to speak about an NDA, that you do have it. So you can only imagine what is in it of that show that I worked on. But that's the structure that I am considering following them in those 2 weeks or so, and then sitting down and having the conversations, because I think it will be very insightful for people to hear, because what moved it from an hour to 4 was that every time they said, then I also had another story. And maybe we thought about somebody else who had another story, and that will then make the web of the documentary. Obviously, I don't want to go all the way over, but that's what I'm thinking about. Yeah.
Anyone else in person? Dr. Henderson?
Why don't you go to online?
Yes, Matt, do we have anyone online?
There are no questions online yet.
Okay. Anyone online, feel free to raise your hand. But Dr. Henderson, in the meantime?
Yeah, I want to ask a question, Sibusisiwe, about the importance of this. I'm going to mispronounce it. Is it
Makoti.
Makoti? Thank you.
Yes.
The importance of this sort of everyday family drama and the specificity of everydayness in a lot of North American television production. There's this genre that has been around forever called the family situation comedy. And it's very difficult to look through the lens of that genre to imagine what is transformative. Although I have no difficulty understanding your point, to think about what's transformative about making everyday stories. So could I ask you to say more? I mean, I'm very moved by this. And if you move away from violent narratives or crime narratives toward a family or a household genre, what is so moving to the people who are writing and watching those series? Or Makoti in particular?
Yes. It's such a beautiful question, because it's a question that a lot of writers in South Africa always have. Not a question, conversations that we always have, even as in terms of what are we selling to the world. We speak about Tsotsi, I'm sure you know Tsotsi, the drama, the violent stories, in terms of also what the world is willing to then take from us as South Africa. Then apartheid is never taken away from us. That becomes the only stuff that we are selling to the world. I'm reminded, I think at the dinner we spoke about Jabulo Ndebele, the rediscovery of the ordinary, where he wrote about South Africans who within the space of apartheid were living their lives. And so many things happened, but yes, it did affect them. But there are also very unique stories about everydayness, and also just cultural differences of navigating. For Ayanda, for this show, it's love. For the other one that I currently write on, it's educational series. It focuses around a town in South Africa, Limpopo, where it's different universities and school kids in South Africa. We've had a lot of teen shows in South Africa also, dealing with everyday lives. That one is centered around the boy child also, in terms of how the boy child navigates themselves around the world, and the boys that we are raising in South Africa, concerning the physical abuse and the kind of atrocities that are created also around women in South Africa. So just that everydayness sense has a lot in storytelling to provide for our communities as South, and also to the world. I would say now those are the conversations of the writers of, if you want to write something, then they're going to say it must be this. It must always have violence. It must always have a snippet of apartheid, then you've got a winner. But there are many other stories that we have to tell about ourselves. And I always go back to that Jabulo Ndebele's rediscovery of the ordinary, where he really speaks about the everydayness of Blackness. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, you're the researcher, but you also mentioned as a pointed out to you that you're also one of the Black Women Auteurs. So what plan do you have in getting yourself inside the story? I mean, what I mean is, do you plan somebody to interview you, or are you going to do some inspection yourself and write about your own experience, or you leave yourself out entirely?
Yes, that's very good. That's a very good. I'm sitting on that one because I didn't intend to do it, but the more I present or speak about it, the more the question is being turned back on me in terms of, but you know, and you know this person also, and you know what they've done. And we laugh a lot about emails, and everybody says, I've got receipts. I can show you what happened, which we need to use for the documentary, because people need to not fall under the same traps that we have seen in terms of an educational purpose for the story. Thank you. I think maybe somebody can interview. I'm not sure, because I think somebody can interview me, but thank you for that point. Thank you for that point a lot. Yes.
Did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I was wondering what your thinking might be around the impact of streamers moving into particularly South African streamers like Prime and Netflix. Because you mentioned that Ayanda was one of the mentors, I think,
For Netflix.
for the Realness Institute, Netflix.
Yeah.
So that's, I know Netflix is looking really intently at South Africa for their episodic content, with Blood and Water being
Yes.
such a successful show. What do you think, how do you think that's impacting, like, the opportunities for Black women writers, television show writers?
I think that in terms of opportunities, it's opening up the industry, which is important. What it was you who also even mentioned that, not just on film. So part of the issues, I would say, it's the racism, it's the structural racism that even when you say, I speak of a 10-year career in it, it's having to navigate that as a Black woman inside the industry, but also knowing that it's not only for the television industry, but unfortunately, it's a very unregulated industry. So more harm happens because there aren't organizations that are taking care of artists and creatives in the country, although people are trying to, but everybody's kind of skeptical in terms of joining. So more work then opens up, then at least the other conversations becomes pay, but at least there's work, which then, you know, it will come to that, but at least there is, and more options. Because what happens a lot in South Africa is that writers are writing for a lot of shows. And somebody was saying the other day, it's not good in a sense that somebody would say they're paying rent with this one, they're paying this with that one. Then the functioning and what writing is supposed to be is not what it is. But unfortunately, that's the reality in terms of making a living. But options are better than none, because if that writer's only maybe writing for a certain one, then they can't really live. But if they're writing for two, then it's manageable. But as more opportunities happen, then the rates then become better also for the writers, because there's options, and the problem has been not having options.
I like what you said, Sibusisiwe, about the ordinariness of Blackness a little bit earlier. And also you began your talk talking about the healing potential of the arts and in South Africa. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, like a lot of the changes that have happened in the last generation and what the impact of arts are for healing.
Restorative narratives for me is not just only seeing a play or a work and saying it's impacted me and I love what the people have put on television. But as a creator and an artist, it's about the people on the ground, all the way to our crew that comes in at 4 o'clock and leaves at another 4 p.m. or even more than a 12-hour day. It's about those people also being in a space of restorative narrative for them, being work that is also guiding their lives, that they are living, that they are human beings who are able to provide for their families while creating this art that people are consuming, but they are being paid well for it. So the restorative part is really about taking care of the people behind the scenes, and not just the work and the exploitation that happens, but what's the work that we are doing to implement change for the people on the ground.
That's very powerful. Thank you very much. Are there any other, Gavin?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I wanted to understand that are there also Black women authors that are engaged in non-formal structures with their content? In Ghana, in Nigeria, we have people who just put out their shows on YouTube, so they don't have to go through the formal structure of a television network by their creators. How is it started?
Oh, it's beautiful. No, it is there. It is there, and people are doing it. A lot of artists are doing it. And there's even work like NGOs that people work with in certain spaces. How I had to come into contact with this, because I also kept asking myself, why do I keep going back to this? And then also ethnographic space, and I was like, but you've worked in this industry for the past 10 years. That's why you are speaking back to it, because it's affected you in a certain way. And that's my I'd say my way in to it in terms of unpacking it and making it better for the legacy and generations that are coming behind me. Because I entered it in 2011 as a 20-year-old. What's the difference that can happen for another 20-year-old now from what I experienced 20 years ago? And having navigated it also with the help of the shield of being in academia, then being able to shield myself and asking the right questions and knowing what to do and making my mark in certain ways because I had the backup of academia or something else to fall back on. How can we make the structure smoother for those that are on the ground? So that's why that is there, and I love it. I've had conversations with Natalia also about other independent filmmakers. But that's one of the main questions I had to center myself with and ask myself, why are you going back to mainstream? Because everybody just says, leave mainstream alone. I'm like, but this is where I worked and it can't be like this for every other child.
Karina and then Lucia.
Yeah. I'm interested in understanding how apartheid has kind of affected the structure of these and access what positions.
Yeah.
And I'm going back, I visited Durban at some point in time, and I've seen how where the where the steam plant is, you have basically white housing which is available. So during the morning, there would be pretty much white people outside. And the evenings, the entire black community. Yeah. Just as a sense of for me, get an idea of who owns or who occupies these structural positions in film and television.
No, thank you. And it got me so excited because it's part of a paper that I was recently writing. And it's unfortunate, but the monopoly or whatever you'd want to call it is, it's bad to just take things out of your head. But I would say, don't be quoted, anybody, on this, but I would say 80% of the economy is not with the people in South Africa. I mean, it's just me saying, but that's not maybe the right, but it's not with. So even with the spaces that we have occupied, especially I would say television, which is then not monitored by the government or by anybody, then from pay issues to the number of Black people. I mean, I was in space. I've been in spaces as the only Black South African. Like, it has never made sense to me to be the only Black one in South Africa, like anywhere else when I'm visiting in the world. So those have been my pressing issues, to walk into the boardroom and I'm the different Black in South Africa. And I never get it. But somewhere else, it makes sense, but not. And back to the acknowledgement for me is that then people can't look you in the eye when you say things like this in South Africa. Then you see how close we are to 1994. It's really very close because nobody wants to acknowledge, because you can still be my friend and I can just say, I'm pro-Black, but that doesn't mean I'm anti-white by saying that. But also, where are we? For me to be in a cohort of 8 people in South Africa, to be the only Black person in this room in 2020 or 2021, it doesn't make sense. So those are the pressing issues on the ground, and it's going to take a while to unravel, I would say. But they are then, and I think it also goes back to the question Natalia was asking, then it then goes to a sense of, then stop asking for a seat in the table and create your own house with many tables that you want. Because if we stay here asking for the seat in the table, we are not going to get into this restorative narrative that we want. We are only going to harm ourselves. So let's start creating houses with other tables to fill in for other people.
Natalia, I think.
It forces a compromise.
Yeah.
It forces you to compromise
Yes.
what you know is necessary in order for better to happen, or
Yeah.
for more space to be created. Just what you were talking about before, so I wanted to ask your comment around like feeling connected to the mainstream, why you feel like you're coming back to
Yes.
the place of television. And I think that the context that's different in the rest of the world than the African context and continental-wide is that Africa is the only place in the world where television consumption is going up. Right? And so broadcasters have maintained this. I was just at Paco in Burkina Faso, where the representative from Canal Plus, the French broadcaster, was parroting that as something he seemed proud of. But of course, there's a consequence for the way the film industry has been underdeveloped across the continent. And so I think it makes a lot of sense for you to continue to come back to this mainstream question, to this question of television and what's happening in that space, because it is actually still the main space. And where the main opportunities are still, not there, as you say.
I would say, when I speak about, even as an artist, I went to drama school and I did theater. But the first artistic thing I saw was on television as a child in Burundi. There's up until today, there's no cinema in Burundi. There's no theater. And it's up until today. It has never been there. The only thing, and it was a thing even to have a TV in those years in 1995, when I was that young, I was speaking about seeing the Gibson Carter shows. It was maybe 2 houses that had a TV in that sense. So there's never been a theater and there is no cinema. And it's 2023, also highly unlikely, but maybe.
And it makes little sense understanding the deep history of theater in South Africa. For there to be no brick and mortar theater in the space, right? Where street theater was quite common, was foundational developing, the industries of television and film. Right.
And that's why Gibson Carter was touring. That's how he was making a living in those years. He was touring community theater in the different townships and spaces, and he even came to Ubundi. He was using township halls as a theater. So that's what township theater was in South Africa. And he was that man. He was the first man in South Africa, Black man, to have a production company for himself. And he made it through that, just making shows in the community halls, traveling throughout in buses under those restrictions in apartheid, but traveling with Black artists, sleeping in the buses because they couldn't sleep anywhere else, but going into halls and providing that. When a mother of mine went to watch the play, she said, "Oh, you're reminding me of my times." And by her times, she meant like back in the day when she used to watch Gibson Carter plays, but they'd be in a township hall where the sound was bad, but they all just went because they loved the shows and it was entertainment. So those kind of things of just forging your way through and making something. Yeah.
Sibusisiwe, have you had contact since last spring with a margin Christian?
Yes, and he told me to say hi.
Oh,
it's just hard to say.
Relationship between community production.
Yes.
In the world that he works, he studied in web series and its many options and the mainstream. I mean, it's and I know he has been in South Africa and he has worked with web series producers there. So I know you're not going to Chicago on this trip.
Yes.
But I hope that when he gets.
I've made amazing connections. They actually even distributing my short film I showed him.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yes, at Open TV now. It just recently released, and he introduced me to Elijah. It's beautiful stuff. Paris is good. Yes.
Paris is good. Does anyone have any other questions? And then anyone online? So perhaps you can thank Sibusisiwe for presenting. I'd like to extend thanks to Avery Page, PhD student, PhD candidate in media studies, for her poster design. She's designed all posters this term. I thought this one especially was a beautiful poster design. I thank Sibusisiwe for presenting and joining us, our modest, very modest graduate student-run speaker series, Mediations. Next week, we are honored to have John Couch to speak to us about using Hamlet's Squattish, do you want to say it?
Making phonosemantic writing systems of universal concepts across languages.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to that. And 4:30, same time, same place, here in person and online. Thanks to Matt. And thank you, Matt, for your help with the tech aspect and making hybrid the role of the future. So thank you very much, everyone.